Clement of Alexandria was one of the earliest Christian leaders in the North African city of Alexandria. He is best known as one of the earliest leaders of the School of Alexandria. He played a significant role in the development of Alexandrian theology, and his role as leader and teacher gives us a great insight into the ideas and debates that were going on in the 2nd century AD. In this video, we will look at the life of Clement of Alexandria, dive into his remaining works, and discuss how he impacted the development of early Christian thought and how his influence on his most famous pupil cost him his sainthood. Clement of Alexandria was born Titus Flavius Clemens. His date of birth and hometown are unknown. Still, it's often listed that he was born around 150 AD. With different traditions citing Athens or Alexandria as his place of birth. His parents were more than likely a part of a pagan tradition, simply meaning they had some connection with the polytheist or traditional pantheon worship in the Greco-Roman world. Because of this, he became well versed in many Roman traditions, and it would be evident in his later writings that these had played a pivotal part in his educational upbringing. But Clement would begin to fall out with his family's belief systems. He would eventually turn his attention towards Christianity. The information about this transition is light, but after being introduced to Christianity, he was officially baptized into the faith at some point. Along with his baptism came a longing to understand Christian teachings at a deeper level. Clement began to seek out many different teachers to help him deepen his understanding, but none worked out long term. However, this all changes when he makes his way to the city of Alexandria and meets a man named Pantaenus. Alexandria was a thriving metropolis at the time of Clement. Its proximity to the Mediterranean Sea made it a famous city for trade, meaning a ton of money flowed through the area. This abundance of wealth drew people from all over the region to settle down. Alexandria became a melting pot of ethnicities, cultures, and languages. On top of that, a thriving philosophical and theological environment would produce significant advancements and ideas that would be foundational for many growing movements. This environment of Alexandria made it a perfect place to create a school for higher education. A Catechetical School of Alexandria arose out of this atmosphere with a leader named Pantaenus, a Stoic philosopher from Sicily. It was as the head of the school when he was introduced to Clement. Clement was taken under his wing and quickly became one of the most prominent students. Clement began to combine his knowledge of Roman philosophy, mystery religions, and his growing studies of Jewish writings to comment upon the teachings of Christianity. His dedication to knowledge propelled him up the ranks in Alexandria. Around 180 AD, Clement took Pantaenus' place and became the new educational leader at the School of Alexandria. His impact was now at an all-time high. He now had the opportunity to help guide the philosophical and theological developments inside and outside of academia. He took the opportunity inside his academic walls to develop a philosophical answer for Christian theology. Outside the walls, he focused on working with those skeptical of seeking knowledge in classrooms. He worked with a group of Christians called pistic Christians who sought to connect their faith with the result of legalistic actions. Clement is not known to have been a big writer, with only a couple of his works lasting until today. The history of Clement's work has been a subject of debate for years. Several works that were once accredited to Clement are now being questioned. Because of that, there are 4 essential works that are undoubtedly authentic works of Clement. The first is a standalone work titled Salvation for the Rich. The second is often called a trilogy, although in reality, it was just 3 works that he had been working on, not necessarily designed to build off of one another. But the titles of those are the Protrepticus, the exhortation of the Greeks, the Paedagogus, the instructor, and the Stromata, miscellaneous. As stated, the trilogy should be seen as 3 different standalone works, but for the sake of discussion, I will discuss all 3 now. Clement's first work, Protrepticus, was written around 195 and it's translated as the Exhortation, referring to the exhortation of the Greeks. In this work, he began an exhortation to the pagans to adopt Christianity. He explained that Greek religions had gone through 7 stages of beliefs that led the way to Christianity. It isn't essential to go through all the levels. Still, he attempted to explain that the development was a foretaste of what would be fully recognized in the Logos, here in reference to Jesus Christ. He finished his argument by drawing a comparison to the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament. Clement believed just as the Hebrew scriptures were a prophetic view of the life of Jesus, the many Greek myths laid a foundation for the pagans to recognize the divinity of Christ and the salvation offered through him. The following work, Paedagogus, was written around 198 and attempted to develop the most genuine expression of true faith in Christ. Clement began developing a philosophical outline for the Christian faith. He attempted to present a type of faith that all Christians could point to as a developed explanation of their faith. The term he used for this true faith was gnosis. This term was supposed to be a contrast to the group of Christians that were referenced to as the Gnostics, who claimed they had secret knowledge that made them true Christians. Clement believed this type of faith was erroneous, and citing secret knowledge meant there was no way to question or critique the information they presented. However, the other reason he focused on creating this gnosis was to try and help lay a foundation for a group of Christians referred to as Pistics, who were skeptical of the philosophical developments happening in Alexandria. The problem Clement had with this group was that he believed that they had let demonstrations of legalistic practices be the example of their faith rather than developing an internalized true faith. Clement feared that if the Pistics did not focus on philosophical developments, their faith would become transactional and a personal relationship with Christ would fall by the wayside. So he tried to show how this attempt at finding a true gnosis would help the practical application of their Christian faith. The final work in the trilogy, titled the Stromata, or the Miscellaneous, was written over several years between 198 and 203. This writing is a collection of many different ideas, making its overall construction different from the previous 2 writings. Because of this, there is much debate about Clement's reason for writing the Stromata. One of the best explanations for this is that it was most likely a collection of his handwritten lecture notes from teaching. This would explain why it covers so many different topics and lacks a real overall narrative. It was likely that Clement intended to come back to this work and combine a lot of the work together, but never got the opportunity for whatever reason. In Stromata, we see an overview of some of the ideas that would come to be associated with Alexandrian Christianity, as well as some personal beliefs not necessarily widely developed in the Alexandrian community. He first talks about the development of Roman philosophy, stating it plays a similar role to the Hebrew scriptures as a foretaste, as he developed in Protrepticus. He also spoke about the idea of martyrdom. He made the statement that martyrdom should not be sought after, arguing that going out of one's way to be martyred was lacking a proper respect for God's gift of life. We would see this mentality come into play later in his own life. He began developing a foundation about hell and sin that some would consider a critical starting point for the idea of universalism. Many draw this conclusion since his work shares many similarities with his most famous pupil, the theologian Origen of Alexandria. Another topic he dove into was the discussion of sexuality. His take was typical of the time, both appreciating and vilifying the idea of sex. He would help develop a connection between the act of sex and the fall of humanity. At the same time, he would write that the idea of sex within marriage was a good and positive thing for both men and women. Another important topic was the development of his teachings on faith. In the early church, a discussion of faith in works had already broken out. The Pistic Christians were a significant example of those who pushed the idea that faith was shown by demonstrating legalistic rules as a demonstration of one's faith. Clement argued that the core faith was belief in Christ, and out of the respect and the new nature given to Christians, acts of faith would be performed. Clement far from resolved the issue, but his work would help promote the idea that faith and the fear of God should be at the center of one's life. When that is centered, the virtues of life will overflow into the practical lives of believers. With all of these topics, you can see why it's called miscellaneous. If you would like to view any of these works in their entirety, I have included free online versions of all of Clement's writings in the description. The final work I mentioned does not have a date associated with it, but it is titled Salvation for the Rich, also known as Who is the Rich Man That Shall Be Saved? This writing is intriguing in the early Christian development of wealth and money. Most of the time, the discussion in the very early church described material possessions as a negative, if not an actual evil, for the faithful Christian's life. But Clement argued wealth was actually a neutral factor, and that the disposition of one's gnosis, or their faith in Christ, would determine the goodness or evilness that comes with those possessions. He argued that the command to give everything to the poor was a commentary on one's attachment to worldly goods, and not a strict and literal requirement. Knowing the context in Alexandria at the time helps to maybe give a reason why Clement believed different than many of his day. The reality was that he was surrounded by many wealthy individuals. It made sense that if he were to equate strictly the idea of faith with poverty, that would be a huge request that many individuals would have to wrestle with, and not only their lives, but the community would be changed entirely by their answer. He does speak about the idea that those entrusted by God with more should be good stewards and not tie themselves to those possessions. But, as he clarifies throughout many of his writings, just giving large amounts of money, property, or possessions does not necessitate a good character. If those acts were done purely to demonstrate good deeds to earn salvation, then none of those acts would help build the actual faith of the believer. But not too long after these famous writings, Alexandria as well as many other areas began facing persecution in the year 202. Those teaching Christianity were targeted, and Clement was faced with a difficult decision. As the leader of the School of Alexandria, he had an opportunity to stand against the very public persecution. But as discussed in his writings, he did not believe seeking persecution was the best move for Christians, if they had the choice. Because of this, he decided to withdraw from his position and went to visit a friend in Caesarea in Cappadocia. When he withdrew, this left an opening for his star pupil Origen, who would become the next leader of the Catechetical School of Alexandria. When he arrived in Caesarea, he realized the man he was going to visit, Bishop Alexander, had actually been jailed at the time for not forsaking Christ's name. Although it seemed Alexander stood up to the persecution while Clement fled, in reality they understood their different reactions, and this did not hamper the relationship. In Alexander's absence, Clement's knowledge and position as a teacher helped keep things running in the Caesarea area. Although there are not a ton of writings about Clement during this time, we can gather that he spent much of his time helping lead and direct local churches, filling in when he could. The next time we see his movements was between 211 or 212 when Alexander wrote a letter to the Church of Antioch, congratulating them on their election of Asclepiades to become their new bishop. Clement was tasked with delivering Alexander's letter to Antioch because he had been faithful to the churches in the area. However, the next writing we have referencing Clement comes in 215 when Bishop Alexander is writing to Origen, Clement's predecessor in Alexandria, and he lists Clement as one of those who had died. Although this is very anticlimactic, learning about his passing through a random correspondence, it is very symbolic of the many lives of Christians in the early church who, after living very faithful lives and growing Christ's influence, passed away without much notice being taken. The legacy of Clement of Alexandria is just as convoluted as his life and writings had been. Most notably, his largest legacy would be in the teaching and handing over of the School of Alexandria to Origen. Origen would go on to become one of the most controversial leaders of the early church. His legacy can't be explicated too fully, since it would take a whole other video to get the full context of his life, but most of the time Clement is brought up is in his context of his pupil Origen. But this context would also make his status in the church questioned. For as late as up to the 1800s, he was venerated as a saint. His feast day was December 5th. But eventually, Pope Clement VIII, I find it ironic he shares the same name, revised the list and dropped Clement from his saint status. The stated reason for changing was that not much is known about his life, and there may have been some of his teachings that became questionable to the tradition of the church. However, it was probably because he became so tied to the teachings of Origen, which the church did not like. But lately there has been a softening of his perception, and many have given him more lenience within the history of the church. But that is all for today. Thank you for taking a look at the life of Clement of Alexandria. If you like this video, you might want to check out the video on the screen now, where we look at Athanasius of Alexandria, a very important bishop in early Christian history, who also had his name tied to the city of Alexandria.